been educated in a developed country in recent years have been given and have accepted, you find that they're not quite what they seem. Let me give you a couple of examples. Probably the most famous example is the peppered moth. This is a light-coloured moth which lives in the northern counties of England, and between the years 1850 and 1900, when the trees were darkened by atmospheric pollution from factory chimneys, the moth changed from a light grey colour to a dark grey colour so that it could remain camouflaged on the tree trunks because the birds eat the moth. Well, this was described, this process, it's even been given a name by Darwinists. It's called industrial melanism, and it was described by the director of the Natural History Museum, Sir Gavin de Beer, as being an example of evolution and even natural selection taking place in man's lifetime. And obviously, if that were true, it would be very powerful evidence. Well, when you look at the peppered moth, you don't need to be a scientist to be able to see that what's happened is that originally you had a lot of light-coloured moths and a few dark-coloured moths, that the light-coloured moths have died off because the trees have turned dark, and that the dark-coloured moths have flourished at their expense. Now, if Darwinists want to call that natural selection, they're entitled to do so. But nobody could possibly believe that that is a mechanism that could explain how one species could turn into another species. And that is what evolution is all about, not about moths changing colour. In the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin made a very interesting observation. He said that he could see no difficulty in a race of bears taking to the water, becoming completely aquatic in their way of life, and ending up looking like creatures, as he said, as monstrous as a whale. In other words, a bear, like a polar bear or a grizzly bear, could turn into a whale, or a whale-like creature, given only enough time, given millions of years and natural selection. Bears could become whales. Now, the interesting thing is that in later editions of his book, he removed this claim. He'd obviously thought about it, thought better of it, and realised that it couldn't be substantiated with evidence. Now, it's fine for an author to change his mind. All authors change their mind. But the significance of this is that the idea that a bear could turn into a whale is the central core idea of Darwin's theory. This is the whole of his theory. So when he removed that example, he was removing the very essence of his book, that one species could turn into another species by natural selection given enough time. Now, no Darwinist today would be rash enough to stand up and say that a bear could turn into a whale, but that is what they believe, or at any rate that's what they teach in schools and colleges. And the idea is unsupported by evidence today, just as it was in Darwin's day when he removed the example from his book. In the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin made a very interesting observation. He said that he could see no difficulty in a race of bears taking to the water, becoming aquatic, and eventually becoming a creature, as he said, as monstrous as a whale. So there you have the idea, bears can turn into whales just given enough time and enough natural selection. Now, in later editions of his book, Darwin removed that claim. He'd obviously thought better of it and realised it couldn't be substantiated with evidence, so he thought he'd better not press it. But the interesting thing about him removing that is that the idea that a bear can turn into a whale through natural selection is the very core idea of Darwinism. It's the top and bottom of the Darwinian theory, that one species can turn into another species. And in removing that example, I can't help feeling that Darwin must have had grave reservations about the rest of his theory. An interesting question is, how did Darwin approach his own theory? How did he arrive at the theory? How did he publicise it? He was a very, very thorough researcher, and he considered many, many possibilities. He considered some ideas which are anathema to modern Darwinists. For example, he gave credence to the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He wrote about a father who'd lost his fingers in an accident and had a son who also had missing fingers. So he was willing to entertain a range of ideas. But I can't help thinking that if Darwin were alive today and he saw what had been made of his theory, the modern neo-Darwinist theory, I think he would be horrified, because the modern theory is quite antithetical to this openness, to this willingness to consider every aspect of living things. The modern theory is a theory of blind chance and nothing more. On the face of it, Darwinism and creationism are opposite theories. They're diametrically opposed. In a funny kind of way, they actually can go together, because Darwinism itself only explains how one kind of creature turns into another kind of creature. It doesn't explain how life originated. Now, creationism is a theory that does explain how life originated. So I suppose you could say that for a person with religious beliefs, Darwinism and creationism could coexist. Darwinism, strictly speaking, doesn't offer an explanation of how life originated. That's a mystery. It's left unspoken. Darwin himself, in a private letter to a friend, conjectured that maybe there was a warm puddle somewhere on the Earth's surface and that a few chemicals got together and that spontaneously the first microorganism came into being. That's been a very popular idea for the last 100 years, but interestingly, no scientist has yet been able to actually synthesize anything from scratch, any kind of living being or any part of any living molecule. Nothing has been synthesized, despite a great deal of optimism on the part of microbiologists. So I think maybe Darwinism, Darwinists are conscious of the fact that there is a rather gaping gap in their theory right at the beginning. Creationists believe that the rocks of the Earth's crust demonstrate that the biblical tale of Genesis is correct and that there was a global flood, that all the creatures on the Earth were destroyed in that flood, and that the sedimentary rocks and the fossils they contain are the relics of that flood. Now, I suppose you would have to say that, strictly speaking, you could interpret the fossils and the rocks in that way. The problem with the theory, from my point of view, is that there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support that view, just as there isn't any evidence to support the Darwinist view. In fact, in many ways, creationism and Darwinism are mirror images of each other. They are really almost religious beliefs, both of them. How did I come to write The Facts of Life? Well, at first my interest was purely in geology. I wanted to collect rock and fossil specimens. That made me begin to question the evidence that I was seeing in the museum, and I wanted to find out for myself exactly what evidence there was to support Darwinism. Were the things that I'd been told at school and in college, were they really true? My own daughter Julia was just starting school. She was going to be taught the same information. Was it right or was it wrong? Well, I spent 10 years in total looking at that evidence again, and I wasn't able to find any one thing that I could say for sure was true about Darwinism. I was disturbed to think that young people were being taught as fact something which I knew was really pure conjecture. When The Facts of Life was published, I then realised what a can of worms I'd opened up, because I was immediately accused of being a kind of secret creationist, somebody who had a hidden agenda. It seemed that scientists found it impossible to believe that any rational person could seriously question the theory that they believed in and had believed in all their lives. And I encountered the most intemperate, I was called stupid, loony, that I was told that I was writing drivel. It was suggested I needed psychiatric help. Prominent scientists were wheeled out to barrage me with personal abuse as a way of just doing away with this troublesome journalist. In a way, I almost sympathise with some of my critics, because they found it literally impossible to believe that somebody could seriously question Darwinism. They found it literally impossible. They were locked in so far to that view that they just couldn't interpret the evidence that was in front of them in any other way other than as being Darwinist. And to them, any attempt to criticise Darwinism had to be the work of either a madman or a creationist. There was just no other way. I think they were unable to conceive that there was an alternative theory, because Darwinism has somehow worked itself into the fabric of our whole scientific and educational system. It's almost the backbone, really, of our scientific thinking. In the life sciences, there just is no alternative theory. It underpins everything. I think also there is a sense in which they're afraid to open themselves to new possibilities, just in case that there's one chink in the armour that is going to bring about the unravelling of the whole fabric of science. I think most people educated in a developed country in the last 50 years have been taught that Darwinism is an absolutely solid theory and that it's backed up by evidence both in the laboratory and in the field. And I think most of those people would be surprised to hear that, in fact, the theory is largely conjecture, and what we've been offered as evidence, when you examine it closely, it simply melts away. For example, the kind of evidence that we've been offered regarding the peppered moth, the evolution of horses, Archaeopteryx, that's the animal that's half reptile, half bird. All this physical evidence that we've been offered and which is in the museums to be examined, when you examine it closely, you find it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. An important question which you can ask here is, what exactly constitutes a scientific theory?